Kia ora koutou. E nā tangata whenua o te tau ihu o te waka Maui, ka nui ne mihi kia koutou. I nā tangata whenua o nā ho e whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Special welcome to all the people from the top of the South, especially our local iwi, and the people from the Four Winds from all over the country who may have joined us today. And also a special welcome to any newly elected Nelson City councilors who may be with us this afternoon. I'm Jim Sinner from the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, and I'd like to start this webinar with a brief karakia. This karakia is called Whakataka Te Hou. Whakataka te hou ki te uru, whakataka te hou ki te tanga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. He hi ake ana, te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohanga. Tina, homie, huie, taikie. This karakia speaks of a man who is on the shore in the early morning going right out to go fishing. And he says this incantation. He says, prepare for the wind from the west, face the wind from the south. It is prickly cold in the land and piercingly cold at sea. The glowing morning is rising on the ice, on the snow, and the frost. Let us gather together, bind, intertwine, let's do the task. And so this, I think, is a fitting incantation for us to get ourselves prepared for the task of meeting Nelson's 8.3% target. I'm going to now hand over to Lindsay Wood and Peter Olorenshaw, who are going to take us through today's webinar. I'll come back later on and manage the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Jim, and tēnā koutou, everybody. And I'm looking forward to presenting with Peter the question of we can meet Nelson's climate targets, and here's how. Here's what we're going to be covering today. I'll give you a brief background, then Peter will talk through the way that the pathways emerge from the council decision-making process. I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing why it's important that we take this target very seriously. Peter will then go into the Nelson context of what emissions in the Nelson region are we actually tackling, and then I'll go into the geeky bit of some of the numbers of how we might be able to meet that target. Then we'll flow into just giving a few examples of some different actions we can try, some at a personal level, some for the council. Then we'll roll into a Q&A. Jim will curate that, and please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you want to post a question, and then we'll close. And then just a little note is that today we're focusing on mitigation. That is the direction of the 8.3% target that Jim mentioned. And another time, maybe we'll talk about adaptation, which is also very important, but that won't be today. So anyway, you probably have a sense of who the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum Targets Group are. There are the 5 of us. We got together about 3 or 4 years ago when it became clear that there were global targets being discussed by the IPCC. There were national targets presented through, for example, the Zero Carbon Act. But in fact, there was nothing that translated those into a regional context. And we very much wanted to have a sense of what that meant in our region. So we spent 2 or 3 years working with that. And then in the middle of this year, when the Nelson City Council adopted the Whakatū-Nelson climate change strategy, there were doubts expressed about whether we could meet the targets. And so we challenged ourselves with trying to find out whether they could be met, and if so, what pathways they might follow. So I just want to give you a bit of a context, if you like, of the strategy. You might look on it a little bit as its pedigree, perhaps. And I'm going to start with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Probably, although they were established well before the Paris Accord, that was really the start of the dynamics and the quantification that gave rise to what we're talking about today. Out of the United Nations and the Paris Agreement came the New Zealand government's 2019 Zero Carbon Act. That in turn set up the Climate Change Commission that many of you will have heard of. And then another thing they did was that they framed up, I've called it a framework, a 1.5 degrees C framework, and that flowed into the work of the Nelson City Council. You may recall that Nelson declared a climate emergency in 2019. The climate team at the council, we've got a great climate team there, and they developed detailed greenhouse gas inventories. Peter in a moment will explain some of the details of those. And then they've also developed mitigation and adaptation plans. And in a way, what we're talking about today is the mitigation side. And out of that came the Whakatū-Nelson climate change strategy, and among other things, the strategy to reduce long-lived greenhouse gases at 8.3% per annum. So where does the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum fit and the targets group? Well, we fit down the bottom there. The group, I've explained the process we did. We had quite a lot of interaction with the council, both in a formal way and informally. We drew data from the IPCC's, what they called their SYR, that's the synthesis report of their AR6, and we took a lot of data from that. We framed some of our work around the Zero Carbon Act requirements, and we even checked our methodology with the scientists at the Climate Change Commission. Out of that, we landed with a reasonable amount of confidence on a figure that supported the 8.3% that is reflected in the Whakatū-Nelson climate change strategy. So with that background, I'm now going to pass over to Peter to talk a little bit about how these pathways came about. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, just lost my words. July the 3rd, and this screenshot, just there, yep, there's a YouTube clip that's available online. And it was a day of impassioned pleas, action, years of costs, mayor, councillors, and even the CEO. It was a day when councillors were asked to choose between two targets for the Nelson City Council regional emissions. Option A, 6.83% annual reduction out to 2035, or option B, an 8.3% annual reduction. The lower target was some way to short of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. The higher target came close. Lindsay will talk more about this. Dismayed by the assertion that many climate change targets have been set, but none had come close to being met, but more so by the suggestion that the dollar cost per tonne of carbon reduced by Port Nelson could be extrapolated across the whole of the city, as though it represented a realistic cost of carbon reductions in the region, and that we were signing up to a strategy with no idea how to meet it. A group of us started furiously emailing each other for ideas on how the target could indeed be met. Ideas bounced around, with many discounted, and many appeared quite possible even with negative costs to the council. These were refined, and eventually Lindsay built up a sophisticated spreadsheet model of pathways of how to meet it. Next slide, please. So in a close vote, the city accepted the higher regional target, even though it offered only a 50% chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees target. Over to you, Lindsay.
Kia ora, Peter. So I want to spend a minute or two just talking about why we should take the 8.3% per annum reduction target very seriously. And so underneath that is how ambitious should our target be? And we have to be really serious about the fact that it's trying to address an escalating existential threat, with existential not being any sort of overstatement. It needs to be ambitious in that. And if I've given a link to the name of a report there, if anybody wants to check out the validity of what I've just said, do read that report. It's not overambitious. Peter referred just now to the IPCC giving it better than a 50% chance of success. Those are really pretty appalling odds for trying to secure a livable future for our mokopuna and their mokopuna. And the other thing is that if we achieved it, we would be helping break a really serious, long-standing history of failed climate actions. Nelson's got its own legacy of aspirational policies that weren't put into place, but they're far from alone. It's been the typical around the world. So the cause of the climate crisis is known. The dire consequences are understood, at least by specialists, and I think that's an area we'll talk a bit more about. And what we need to do is clear. We need to rapidly cut emissions, especially carbon dioxide and especially methane. We're going to be talking today about carbon dioxide because the 8.3% relates to what are called long-lived gases, and they exclude methane. They do include some other long-lived gases beside carbon dioxide, but we won't go into the details of those at the moment. So a suitably ambitious target, if we do that, it's us really saying we'll take ownership of our own impacts on the climate. We acknowledge that historically we've caused a lot of emissions, and we will actually step up and do our share on trying to address them. And the other thing I think is worth being said, that in a world where different areas have really struggled to meet their targets, Nelson is really well placed to do that. We're a small city, which is a good start. We've actually got a very engaged citizenship. And additionally, we have an economy in Nelson, one of the most remote regional economies in the whole world, that is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate. There's a lot of stake and a lot of good reason to give it a go. So it went through my mind, why, with all those things, might we not strive to achieve the 8.3% target? And I came up with quite a few reasons, which I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I do just want to unpick a couple of them. If we're too afraid of falling short to even try, now that is in a way one of the ways it's been framed, that because the world has always failed to meet its targets, we shouldn't even try them. And I've suggested that's a bit like a captain calling abandoned ship. If you're on a boat that's running towards the rocks, then saying we're not even going to try and steer away from the rocks is akin to saying abandoned ship. Also, I just want to comment on the last one down there. If we believe we're somehow special and have reasons not to act, the world, everybody's got a reason why they should not actually have to step up and do their bit. The outgoing Climate Change Commissioner, Rod Carr, when he gave what was in essence his valedictory speech at the Agriculture and Climate Conference last year, he was called out almost every country in the world. Every country, their primary industry tends to plead and often succeed in getting special consideration, whether it's the automotive industry in Germany or the oil sector in Canada or mining in Australia or agriculture in New Zealand. We all think that those shouldn't have the normal demands placed on them. So what must we do to effectively tackle climate change? It's not lack of, sorry, that's faded out a bit from it. It's not a lack of knowledge of knowing what to do. It's a lack of resolve to do the right things at the right scale and the right pace. Societies, let's be honest, we've got huge momentum based on climate harming activities. We're based on a fossil fuel society. We build extensively with concrete, which accounts for about 5% of the world's emissions. So we've got lots of stuff we need to change to tone down our emissions. I've just talked about the massive vested interest, particularly in the primary industry sector in all parts of the world. Even in Finland, for goodness sake, their forestry sector wants more favourable treatment. And there's also a human tendency, all of us tend to resist change, and we tend to ring fence our lifestyles and our beliefs. So to break that cycle, and goodness me, we do need to break it, we really have to lift the level of public awareness and engagement. And we also then need to determine and agree well-founded courses of action. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Peter to explain to us what courses of action we need, or what emissions we're tackling in the Nelson area. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. So here's a pie chart of Nelson's regional CO2 emissions updated to 2040, 2024-25. And unlike any provincial towns, in that there's no significant room in agriculture, our emission profile is more like Auckland than Tasman's. It's completely dominated by transport at 72% of our regional emissions. Next slide, please. Our emissions profile is also very different to the country as a whole. Here in Nelson, emissions from animal agriculture are only 6% rather than 50% of the total. And while all little things help, without seriously dealing with our transport emissions, we have no hope of meeting our climate change target. Next slide, please, Lindsay. Okay, so what part of transport are these emissions coming from? Is it from our airport being the 5th busiest in terms of airport movements in the country? Well, no, that's only a small piece of the transport emissions, as are off-road use by diggers, scrapers, bulldozers, farm vehicles. And despite our port being the busiest fishing port in the Southern Hemisphere, maritime emissions are only a tiny proportion. Fully 3/4 of our transport emissions come from road vehicles. Next slide, please. Light passenger vehicles, petrol plus diesel, make up nearly half of our transport emissions, even without adding double cab utes, shown here in light commercial vehicles, used as everyday private vehicles. Next slide, please. Emission reductions we can sleepwalk into. This is a graph by Bloomberg of electrified vehicle uptake previous to now and predicted into the future. Nelson, New Zealand's EV share of new registrations of light vehicles is currently running at 6%, 11% EVs plus PHEVs. There is good reasons to expect it to pick up to the European and global averages of around 30% quite rapidly. China is over 60%, Norway the outlier, but not shown on this graph, but showing what is possible with over 90% of new vehicles being EVs. Next slide, please. There are already compelling EV alternatives to fossil cars and vans, and increasingly for light trucks. EV versions of heavy trucks and workhorse utes are now EV Radara ute. Yes, it can tow a 3-ton trailer and carry 1 ton in its tray, even if its 300-kilometre range would be reduced significantly in those situations. And it can wade through over 800 millimetres deep water better than the most popular ute in the category. Like their plug-in hybrid PHEV versions, they offer compelling advantages such as being able to run a building site from the plugs in the back of the ute. Here is how Ford is marketing their PHEV Ranger ute. Use onboard power to do welding, not just charge up drill batteries, but actually do welding. Next slide, please. Although the efficiency gains from new fossil fuel engines are minimal, the change from pure fossil to hybrid fossil represent a jump in efficiency, a step change in emission reductions, even more so with plug-in hybrids. The Ford Ranger PHEV is $25,000 more than the equivalent fossil fuel ute, but here's the thing, they aren't equivalent. They offer zero tailpipe emissions around town and perhaps most of the time. They've got 100k range, 80k actual real life range, 7 kilowatts of power and outlets in the tray. This slide shows the diesel ute on the left and a PHEV ute on the right with your economy ratings. A caveat here, to get to these efficiency gains, you do need to plug them in. Where people have access to free fossil fuel in their company PHEVs, but have to pay for charging it up at home overnight, a lot of these savings evaporate. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Peter, for that. So now, as I mentioned, I'm coming to the geeky bit where how might we actually meet the 8.3% per annum target? And rising to that challenge, we really need to do things differently. Hence the reference repeatedly to all the failed aspirational policies before. How do we do it differently? And we've identified really a 2-prong approach. The first prong won't surprise you too much, quantify all the actions. And I'm going to shortly talk about the details of the greenhouse gas inventory that Peter has just explained. But the other side that's really important is how we engage the community and bring the community along. And processes for public education in a general sense, and also for community buy-in, we see as critical. And if we achieve both of those, then we'll get concerted actions to reach our target. And the key word there is concerted, where we all understand enough to work together. Just two qualifications in there. The word integrated is especially important on transport, as we will see to some degree. There are so many different facets to it that if we just pick and choose one or two, we're likely to lose most of the benefit. And when we talk about processes, we're talking about, for the community, we're talking about a lot more than the consultation that we normally think of when the council is going through a new policy. So we've developed a tool to quantify actions against the 8.3% per annum. And here's the process we adopted. We took the Nelson's 2019-20 greenhouse gas inventory. That's the latest available with the level of fine detail that we wanted, such as the transport one that Peter just explained to you. Then we had to recalibrate all that data into 2025 because we needed to align it with that starting point for the 8.3% reductions that the strategy calls up. Then we identified a suite of potential actions to apply. We've got 15 so far in the tool. It could take more, but that's where we got to at this point. And then we strove to align those with the council's annual long-term plan funding cycles. Now, we didn't pick exact details in the plans. We just sort of tried to set the starts of different activities to reflect the fact that they could be included in the next annual plan or the next long-term plan. And then we tested different combinations of those actions to see how they measured up against the 2030 outcomes. So here's what we call the input dashboard from the tool. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk you through every detail. I do want to explain one or two things though. Down the left, you'll see those pale brown figures. They are the 11 strategies that relate to transport. Down the bottom, the blue ones are 3 more strategies that relate to what is called stationary energy, that is the use of energy that is non-transport, such as the heating of buildings or commercial cooking. And then down the bottom, that brick-colored one is decarbonising industrial processes and product use. That might be things like the refrigerant gases that are used in cool stores and supermarkets, or in fact some of the things on building sites and so on. I'm not going to talk through them all, but I just want to illustrate one or two how it works. So this is the electrification of the private fleet with battery EVs. So in this case, we've taken a figure of 3% per annum change in the vehicle fleet, the private vehicle fleet, that is, and that reflects roughly the level of adoption that Peter a moment ago said, it's not unreasonable to think we can achieve that. If we jump down a bit, you might have heard of the Swap One initiative. In fact, Jim, who introduced this show, was on national radio the other day just talking about it. Swap One is where we encourage people to adopt strategies to get out of a fossil fuel car they're driving and find a low carbon way to travel. And we'll see how that affects it. Further down, we've got decarbonized stationary diesel use. So, for example, there are now available what are called drop-in biofuels. These are very low carbon fuels that can just replace mineral diesel in things like the heating system for the council's office building. And I do want to talk in the middle there a little bit about getting rid of congestion, because it's a double whammy, a double benefit for us. Typically, global experience is that if congestion, charging, or the likes, time of use charging, what that is charging people who want to travel during peak hour. So it's to encourage people to either travel away from peak hour or to say take public transport or bike or even ride share to reduce the peak demands. When the peak congestion charging comes in, typically congestion just drops 20% almost instantly. The other thing that's often not discussed, though, is that 20% leaves 80% of the peak hour traffic, and that all flows so much better. So they flow smoothly, and their emissions drop as well as their fuel consumption and their costs, of course, to go with it. And of course, there's less demand on parking and all sorts of other benefits. So let's have a bit of a look now. I'm going to play a demo, a video just showing how the tool works. So let's see what happens when we populate values against those activities and how that affects decarbonisation. On the left of this view is the table we've just been talking about in the last slide, but with all the percentages for the different activities blanked out. The key thing here is the right-hand side is the output dashboard. Each of these columns represents a year starting in 2025 through to 2030. And the height of the grey column represents the amount of the long-lived greenhouse gases in the Nelson region, starting with 260,000, which is about the 2024-25 year total. It hasn't dropped at all across there yet because we don't have any active decarbonisation values. But the objective is to progressively reduce these across here so that when we get to into 2030, we're virtually down at where the target is of 169,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So let's see what happens when we actually start to decarbonize that. You'll see on the left, as I populate it, red figures appear. So with a bit of luck, you see some red figures. The first one is electrification of the private vehicle fleet. And it's also triggered fractions of other ones, which we won't go into at the moment. The next one is a similar process for hybrids. And then we're going to look at the electrification of the heavy goods fleet, especially after the introduction of a charging station at the port. Now, if we have a look at the effect of people participating in swap one type activities to reduce the amount of commuter travel that they do. That's a biggie. The next two are peak congestion charging or time of use charging in two steps. Firstly, the drop of vehicles that happens almost always instantly. So there's a reduction there. And then the next one is the improved efficiency of all the other vehicles. Now we get on to if people choose to reduce their own elective discretionary travel a bit, there's a bit more. There are a few other small ones on transport. We're just going to skip over those. And now we'll have a look at the non-transport energy use, particularly in the first case, decarbonising the grid. You will see that coming in as blue lines. And then a bit more non-transport energy, decarbonising stationary diesel use, such as heating the council's office building, and then similarly decarbonising LPG, such as in commercial cooking and the like. And finally, how do we get on decarbonising industrial processes and product use? And there's the effect of that coming in as brown. So what are the takeaways from this? Well, I think the first big takeaway is we've almost made our target. So that's been essentially a successful exercise. The other next one is that it shows very clearly how transport is the big player in the Nelson region. We know that. And I think the third point is that we've got there by a succession of about 15 different activities. Not one of them would get us all the way on its own, or not even two or three. We have to be looking at a suite of activities. So I hope that's given you a bit of a glimpse as to how it works. And back to the rest of the slideshow now. So picking up on that, this is also another view of the input dashboard, but I want to start over on the right-hand side, first of all, with those three charts, because what we're trying to demonstrate here is that there's many more pathways than just one way to get there. So the top one that's shown as general is actually similar to the one we've just looked at. The next one down to high private changes, where we've toned back the level of commercial change and increased the level of private uptake. And then item 3, the third image, is the reverse of that, where we've toned back the private uptake and emphasized the commercial uptake. So the point there is, although those three charts at first glance look very similar, they're actually representing quite different processes of getting there. And there's a hint of that if you compare the colors in 2 and 3, you'll realize that number 3 in the bottom right has a lot more of the color. It's got more of the blue, bright blue and the brown on it than the other ones. But just to illustrate a bit where some of those differences, the top one, uptake of the private electric battery EVs in the private fleet. You'll see the general one is at 2.5%. That's beefed up to 3% on the average one that's there, but it's toned right back down to only 1% on the commercial one. So there's a factor of 3 difference there. If we go down to the next red box, that's the electrification of the heavy goods vehicles and buses. You'll see that in the middle one, the private one, it's only 5%, but it steps up to 3 times that, to 15%, and a high level of commercial uptake. And then going right down the bottom, which is decarbonising stationary diesel use, at the private uptake, we've put that right down at 1%, but the commercial one is 20 times that at 20%. So there are lots of different ways we can get there. Now, there's also lots of different ways we can look at the input dashboard, and this is one that talking about how much they cost. In his introduction, Peter referred to the concern over some of the figures that were put around about the cost of decarbonisation strategies. If you look across the top there, you'll find those colours are in essence a legend for all the information below them. So the light blue items are where there's a modest cost to the council, and the council's only a catalyst, and the cost is in essence borne by personal costs. And we'll talk in a minute about the fact that even the EVs needn't be a personal cost. The green ones are where there's a modest cost, but the council is quite a key player in that. So, for example, if they're involved with effects to change intensification of the inner city area, then they need to engage strongly in planning change processes and things like that. And then the lilac colours are the ones where the council has significant investment. And I'm sorry, I should have actually put these down there. So you'll see the lilac ones, for example, the bus investment in improving the bus fleet, but we have flagged that to not happen till after 2028. Also, things like implement time of use charging. That may well be a revenue generator for the council, depending on the arrangements with central government. And then finally, in activity 11, where the complete the cycle network, that is recognised internationally as one of the most cost-effective climate actions. And then finally, down the bottom, we really think the council should commit funds, and there's some of the earliest commitments to funding active community education and engagement. If the community's on board, then the other things will fall into place that bit better. So what about harnessing the community engagement? It's known that politicians fear a public backlash from adopting robust climate policies. There are jokes about that you adopt it and then you don't win the next election. And even Mayor Nick has talked to me about that in an interview with him. I don't want to single you out, Nick. It's you could find people all over the world who have the same apprehension. But citizen buy-in, if the citizens buy into the climate strategies, takes a lot of that monkey off the politicians' backs, because the citizens are encouraging strong action. And when they understand the issues, they do tend to back the necessary action. There's a great example in Stockholm where, against public wish, they brought in a trial of congestion charging. 70% of the public opposed it. They brought it in just the same, trialed it for 6 months, and afterwards did a referendum, and 70% of the population really supported it. Similar sort of result in Madrid, not Madrid, in Milan, where they did something, and there are other cases around the world. Interestingly, late last year, the MFE produced a report on citizens and climate, and they discovered that people want more climate information from their government and businesses. So going down to the bullet points, we need visible and visionary leadership from council to rally our community and get us on board. We're a great fan of having strong iwi involvement and in the Indigenous knowledge that they can bring. There are lots of citizen-friendly ways to engage. I've given a few there, but we'd like the council to consider seriously an active funding regime. We could actually have some quite big events here, like climate conferences and so on. But then I mentioned last there citizens' assemblies, which many of you will have heard of. They are a robust and increasingly trialed and proven way of getting much better citizen buy-in across the whole spectrum of citizens. A great example was in Auckland, where the city there realized they would need probably to recycle water rather than just keep drawing fresh water from more rivers. But they were running scared of putting that to their citizens. They ran a citizens' assembly, and lo and behold, when they had all the information put to them, the citizens reached the same conclusion. So what are the key takeaways? Well, decarbonising at that rate is within reach, and there are different ways we can do it. There's no single silver bullet. It won't be easy, but it needn't be miserable either. None of those things create a situation of misery. Decarbonising transport is absolutely critical. Peter's talked about it being road transport being over 75% of the long-lived gases. It will require an integrated suite of actions. I discourage the council from just cherry picking and trialing 2 or 3. Many actions are very low cost or even generate revenue. We have to keep that in mind. Eliminating congestion brings an amazing array of benefits. We could go into them another time. And then in parallel, we need a deep community awareness and engagement. So what are some examples? Well, I'm going to give you a couple, and then Peter will give a couple as well. EVs win hands down on cost as well as emissions. I have developed a tool comparing the same cost of a petrol car and an EV. And in this case, this is one example, identical overall costs for 5 years, and then EVs went all the way. What's the vehicle on the left? A 2013 Nissan Bluebird, which was on Trade Me the other day at $10,000, a petrol car. On the right is a 2021 Hyundai Ioniq at 22,000, all electric. You would think that there's no comparison in how the running costs will go. But get a load of this. To finance it, supposing you had $4,000 and borrowed $6,000 to meet the $10,000 price of the Bluebird, and you paid it off over 5 years. Put in same 4,000, but this time borrow 18,000 over 5 years to purchase the Ioniq, and you think that's a no-brainer. It's not going to work. The run and repayment cost for the vehicle on the left, that's the Bluebird, is about $8,800 a year to pay it off in 4 years. I've worked it out for exactly the same repayment for the Ioniq, again over 5 years. And here's what you get. At the end of 5 years, you own both of them outright. On the left, you've got a petrol car worth about 4,500. On the right, you've got an all-electric car worth 10 grand. Big difference there. And you've enjoyed driving the quieter, more modern car for the 5 years there. After you own it outright, after 5 years, the cost to run the petrol car is about 7 grand a year. The cost to run the electric one is about 4,200. Obviously, they're at present day costs. And get a load of this. The emissions over 5 years is about 22,000 kilograms of CO2 for the petrol car. It's well under a tenth of that for the electric car. So much for quite a big decision. Let's just have a look at, I'm sorry, there we go. Let's have a look at another smaller one. Save money and time by travel planning. So I've already talked about the Swap One initiative, and there's the website for it. Very simple address. Maybe just plan shopping ahead of time and eliminate some short trips. Or you could play what I've called the personal target game with your discretionary travel and say, oh, can I get through a week with under 100 kilometers of non-essential travel? Okay, a low-cost action, bring congestion charging, and we've talked enough about that. I'll flick on to Peter and hand over to you, Peter.
Unmute me. Yeah, thanks for that, Lindsay. Lindsay's talked about congestion charges, but just noting here that reduction actions, some of them are actually cost negative or at worst cost neutral. And we've talked about congestion charging, but the income from these could be recycled into ways to help people avoid the charge, e.g. better buses, safer biking. Likewise, with peripheral parking charges, that's parking around the periphery of Nelson City, for instance, or Stoke, or Richmond, that is currently free, that tends to discourage car commuting. And so the income from that could be put to ways to avoid those charges. People could avoid the charges, e.g. better buses, safer biking. And EVs could be incentivized through basing parking and congestion charges on emissions of the vehicle. People already put in their number plate when they're paying for paying for parking charges at the moment. Once you've got that number plate, you know what the emissions of that vehicle are. And so, hence, with these differential charges with emissions, you would be incentivized to use EVs rather than fossil fuels. And again, minimal costs to councils. Next slide, please, Lindsay. And just to note here that the Netherlands has over half its trips being made by bike in their best cities, and something like a quarter of all trips averaged across the country, making it the best place to bike in the world. Next slide. So this is a graph from the World Economic Forum showing that it's also the best place to drive. So it might be the best place to bike, but it's also the best place to drive. It's a completely different country, sure, but the point is good cycling infrastructure does not have to mean poor driving experience. Next slide, please. People in Holland don't bike or use PT a lot because they're a nation of greenies, or that it's never windy or never rainy there. No, they ride because it's a no-brainer. It's the quickest, most convenient, and most enjoyable. Yes, our countries are vastly different, but we can learn from them that to get a bigger uptake of low-carbon commutes, we just need to make them the most attractive. And the litmus test of that is women and kids. If it's not attractive to them, you've failed. Next slide. I'm not sure how we're going for time here. So how can we make low-carbon commutes most attractive? In addition to the sticks and carrots, the sticks of congestion and peripheral parking charges, there are these carrots. Priority lane for buses. I won't go through the examples, but that's one way to make buses faster than cars so that you get there quicker on a bus than you do driving. Encourage urban intensification so that people can easily walk or cycle to where they need to go. Council can do this with partitioning, for instance, at no cost to them. Fix gaps in the cycle network. There's a variety that I've listed. Next slide, please. Airport departure tax. Hamilton used to have one, suggest $5, negative cost to the council to discourage excessive flying. Ban new LPG installs, zero cost to the council, but a useful reduction in emissions into the future. Ratepayer assistance schemes so that people can swap out gas hot water for heat pump hot water systems or install solar plus batteries or buy e-bikes and cargo bikes. And here's one that council should budget for promoting green funding options from other sources. So this is really leveraging other sources with only a small input from the council. And perhaps a fee-based building consents where you offer a low or no consent fees for high Homestar rated houses, that's high performance houses, paid for by higher consent fees for lower performance ones. Again, no cost to the council. Next slide, please. And yeah, these low interest loans offered by all the major banks for energy saving things on your ordinary home, on your home, are also available for EVs, but that includes e-cargo bikes as well as ordinary e-bikes. Normally loans are well above the rate of inflation, but these are a third of current inflation rates. It's costing you money not to take them out. You do need to have an existing mortgage to take one of these out though. So I hope we've shown here that there are a number of pathways of how the Nelson region can meet the 8.3 degrees per annum emission reduction target, and that many of these initiatives to do so come at a low or even negative cost to the council. Next slide, please, Lindsay. That concludes the presentation part of the webinar. Now over to Jim in the Q&A.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lindsay. I just want to, first of all, encourage Attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And while you're thinking about adding a question, I just want to maybe just emphasize that those last set of actions that Peter was going through are all additional to the ones that Lindsay presented in the tool. So the tool is a suite of actions that we've already calculated can get us there. The actions that Peter presented are all additional. There's more things we could do that could build on, reinforce, and support the actions that Lindsay outlined. So there's a number of different ways we can meet the target. It's a question of putting our mind to it and building a public consensus around the commitment to doing so. Okay, we've got a question from Debs Martin. Debs asks, if we don't do this collaboratively with Richmond and Tasman, do we run a risk with these initiatives, especially with the fact that, especially around the driving and car parking narrative, because many of the cars that come into Nelson come from Tasman. So do we need to coordinate and collaborate with Tasman District? Lindsay, do you want to answer that one?
I'll have a crack at that. Hi, Debs. Thanks for your question. I think the answer is collaboration is always a good thing, but all of our data and calculations are based on the Nelson City's own greenhouse gas inventory. Nelson actually has supported Tasman in developing their own detailed inventory, which has a very different look to Nelson's, as Peter touched on early on. So the answer is yes. It's a bit like I was saying, an integrated suite of transport strategies is better. An integrated policy approach between different councils is better, even if we're in our own regions trying to solve different problems.
And if I can add to that, we have a regional transport committee again. They did split at one stage and now they're back together. And so any congestion charges would most likely be regional across the region. And we can see that Richmond has as much of a congestion issue on the deviation and Queen Street State Highway 6 intersection, for instance, as the worst congestion in Nelson. So it's not unique just to Nelson.
Thanks for that.
Picking up a little bit more again is that if Nelson, for example, put in effective time of use charging on Waimea Road and Wakatu Drive, then that would actually have a ripple effect back into reducing a lot of the traffic through Richmond as well. So even without cooperation, there might be benefits across the different regions.
Thanks for that. We have a question from Josh Linhauser. Josh asks, well, first of all, he says, thanks, great overview and insights. He says Tasman District has a different emission profile than Nelson, with the more traditional rural composition to its emissions. Is there a similar strategy or investigation being completed for Tasman District with sensitivity analysis looking at different scenarios? Lindsay, have you looked at Tasman?
Jim? Yep. Thanks, Josh. That's a good question. The answer is yes and no. The yes bit is we'd love to plug in Tasman data into it. It's not just a matter of dumping in data because there's a bit of fine tuning to be done, but it's an exercise we'd love to do. The fact that they are very different profiles doesn't prevent us being able to do that. Particularly the Nelson strategy is based on what is called gross long-lived gases. Now, the gross bit means that you don't give any credits for things like forestry, and the long-lived, as I mentioned at the beginning, is things like CO2 and some of the other gases, but not methane. So one of the big differences between Nelson and Tasman is the big rural effect and also the extensive forestry and national parks in Tasman, but they actually fall outside the particular number crunching we were doing, and therefore with the right set of data, which is available for Tasman, we just haven't done it, by using that data and doing the right calibration of it, the answer is yes, we could do it, and I'd actually be very interested to give that a shot.
Thank you, Lindsay. Peter, a question for you from Joanna Santa Barbara. Would you care to comment on the health benefits of these actions?
Yeah, we didn't mention that, but of course, stopping fossil fuel emissions, it's not just CO2 that's coming out those exhaust pipes. It's also particulates and particularly with diesels, NOx coming out as well, which has billions of health costs for the economy throughout the country. So yeah, there's massive benefits there, but also not just from the what people are breathing in, but also it's much more healthy. Even if you're catching a bus, there's walking involved at the start and end of the journey that you don't have with a car journey that's from door to door. And of course, with biking, it's even better. You're getting this additional everyday exercise, which is what we should be aiming for.
Am I allowed to chip in, Jim?
I was going to say that we've identified a study published in the British Journal of Medicine last year, a study of commuters in Scotland, which showed a 47% reduction in overall mortality associated with cycling, with commuting by bicycle. It's just amazing the health benefits of cycling, and that's people think that, oh, you're riding in traffic and you're breathing in all these fumes. Actually, sitting in a car, you're breathing those same fumes, and you're not getting any exercise. So you're much better off on your bicycle.
It's a
Okay.
no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I just add a little bit, please, Jim?
Yeah.
First of all, to clarify for listeners or viewers that don't know, when Peter referred to NOx, he was referring to the different oxides of nitrogen that are involved with car emissions. But the other thing I want to just add is that he mentioned the billions of dollars of costs of fossil fuel vehicles. It is billions. Typically, every fossil fuel vehicle on the road causes about $2,000 a year of costs of the health system. And picking up on Jim's point, is research last year in Auckland found that vehicles in slow stop-start traffic, all the occupants of those cars endure huge cardio changes due to the fumes in the cars that are not nearly so bad when the traffic is moving well. So there's yet another reason to get rid of congestion.
Thanks, Lindsay. I have a question from Olivia Cunningham. Olivia asks, how do you plan to keep pressure on the council to implement these actions? How do you intend to make all Nelsonians and Tasman residents aware of what options they have to reduce their costs as well as their carbon footprint? People get overwhelmed thinking, but what can little old me really do? Showing this list could help, and especially point out the cost savings like your car example. People are doing it tough and will think the green stuff is just an extra cost that they can't afford. Peter, do you want to comment on that? I guess there's two elements here. How do we keep pressure on the council? And the second, how do we raise awareness amongst our residents that there are benefits, not just costs?
Sure. So the council signed up to this target, 8.3% reduction per year. So it's not a waffle would like. They've actually signed up for it. So I think it's up to organisations like the Climate Forum and other NGOs to continually keep pressure on the council to ask how they're meeting these targets and how they intend to. And yeah. As far as costs go, I think there's a role here for the council to actually promote things like I mentioned how the council should actually have a budget for showing people what low interest loans and things are available for people to get these EVs, e-cargo bikes, which often replaces a car, or just ordinary e-bikes. Shows them how they can do that without breaking the bank. There's work ride schemes where you can your employer can put that cost of that e-bike onto your take it off your wages just a little bit each week, so you hardly notice it. So I think there's a role of the council for that. Also, the Climate Forum, of course. Yeah.
Can I just chip in briefly? I'm always doing this, sorry. I think also something that all the individuals can do is drop a note to their council saying, yes, we want you to get on and give this a go. And yes, we support the idea of spending money on public education. Peter mentioned the Climate Forum and other NGOs, for example. Peter convenes NELSUST, which is a long-standing and very successful transport strategy group. But also individuals can have an important part in just putting a small voice into the council.
I'd like to just add a little bit to this as well. I think that leadership from our civic leaders is really important and can make a huge difference to the success of all of these strategies, whether it's the uptake of EVs or bus patronage and active transport, because our civic leaders can add basically a nudge to everyone's decision making. We all know that doing these things will be good for us financially and for our physical and mental health, but often inertia prevents us from taking the jump. But so when the public narrative from our civic leaders says that we should all do this together, we can make a difference for the good of the city and the good of our planet, that helps to overcome that inertia because we want to be seen as doing our part. Conversely, if our leaders say, "Oh, this is all too hard, it doesn't really matter, we can't afford it," etc., then of course people just give up and don't do anything. So I think it's really important that our leaders get out and support this and encourage people to be part of the community effort. We have a question from Tim Riding, who says, "Thanks for your korero, everyone. As per Joanna's question, is the council factoring the co-benefits for non-market values, e.g. both air and water pollution, biodiversity, etc., for these decarbonizing approaches? I'm certain the co-benefits will add to the value of these actions for council and ratepayers alike." Lindsay, you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, cheers, Jim. The answer is not directly. Certainly, they're not factored in our tool. Our tool is very much based on changes in actions rather than downstream benefits. But it's quite complicated to do that because often you're assuming levels of change. But it is a very important aspect, thanks, Tim, because it is a point. It's not just doing what we're showing on the screen or what our tools show, but as Peter talked about when he was talking about congestion, there are all sorts of other things. I mean, just one simple thing about reducing congestion is suddenly it's easier to find a park in town, or we don't have the pressure to build so many new highways because the vehicle numbers have dropped. So yes, a good idea, but the answer is not factored in to the tool that we're using, and I don't think council does directly either.
Thank you, Lindsay. We have a couple more questions. I just want to point out that we are coming up to 1 o'clock. We will stay on a bit longer if people want to keep carrying on the conversation, but we certainly understand those of you who need to leave, and we want to thank you very much for attending the webinar. So a second question from Olivia. She's asking, has a light rail or tram between Richmond, Stoke, and Nelson ever been considered? And if so, what are the blockers?
Yeah, can I answer that one?
Yeah, Peter.
Olivia, NELSUST in the past has been pushing for this, but importantly, it was piggybacking on a inland port for the port that would rail goods to the ships when the ships came in, so that the port would have some very valuable portside land freed up, and wouldn't need more reclamation, for instance. But also it would take trucks off Rocks Road, which is quite a hot button topic for people. But the tram itself wouldn't be viable just by itself. And in the short term, that's what we're trying to do with the buses. You may not know, but two of the buses, the country buses, the one from Motueka, the one from Wakefield, run as express buses between Richmond and Nelson on the motorway, so that they get in pretty quick, and the difference in speed between a bus with minimal stops traveling on Pokatu Drive and a tram is pretty minimal, really, and it's much easier to set up. And so particularly if we've got priority lanes for buses, perhaps also for trade vehicles and T3 people with 3 people in the car, then they're not held up by ordinary people commuting in their cars, so that could run just about as fast as a tram, at least on the main parts of the route, or 90% of the route. Yeah. So it's a long answer, but to summarize, perhaps long term, I think there is something to be said for this. But the tram would have to, I think, piggyback on the inland port that many ports have for the Port Nelson. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. We have no more questions, and so we do have I wanted just to come in a comment from Fred saying, great analysis, thank you. Local government amendment bill, systems improvements currently before Parliament that would largely restrict councils to infrastructure such as pipes and roads and economic growth, risks strangling climate action investment by councils. Need to focus on revenue generating of low-cost actions. I think he's saying need to focus on actions that could generate revenue, so it doesn't impose a cost on council. What are the priorities if this comes to pass? So which actions would be prioritized if councils are restricted in what they can do to focus on actions that would generate revenue?
I would plug in there. Thanks, Fred. Good question with a bit from a bit the left outfield. I would plug first of all for the serious question of getting a good citizen engagement on the way. But then if you look at the dashboard, maybe I should just flick back to it, should I? Where are we? I've got a, if I go back, there we are. If I go to that dashboard there, you can see all the blue items there are very low cost to the council. Some of them, like different charging that Peter talked about, generate revenue potentially. There's a low setup cost and then a long-term gain. Time of use congestion charging is another one that has an initial setup cost, not massive, but then it's a revenue generator. So I think, I mean, I hope that the change in the local government doesn't come to pass. The Local Government Act itself talks about one of the main purposes is the well-being of the community, and that goes a long way beyond building roads and putting in drains.
I think also some of those measures that Peter mentioned at the end about changing our parking strategies could generate some revenue and could be quite successful at driving behavior change, especially if you tag those parking charges to the emissions of the vehicle and give benefits to low emission vehicles in terms of parking charges. So I think there are ways and strategies that we could address that if those restrictions come into view. I have another question, I guess last question from Lucy and David. Lucy, I think, says, I find many people and businesses struggle to get out of the mindset that I don't make much difference. It doesn't affect me right now. I'll just keep on as I am for the moment. Do you have any ideas on a great way to get people to flip into thinking about what can I do or how can I help?
Yeah, we've probably both got ideas on this, Lindsay, but if I kick off, I think we need to keep focusing on the per capita emissions, and our per capita emissions are actually quite high, if you look at the graph, the per capita emissions of China, everyone says, oh, China matters more than we do. If you look at the per capita emissions, China and New Zealand have only just crossed over. China's only just more per capita in emissions than we are, and yet we've got a historical much bigger footprint per capita emissions than what China has. So that's important to keep that focus. The emissions of our 5 million people matter just as much as any 5 million anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. You can't say if our emissions don't matter, then a certain city of 5 million in China doesn't matter. I think we need to keep stressing that argument. Yeah, and the old thing of a bucket is made up of, water drops, each drop's completely insignificant, but, joined together and it's not insignificant. And lastly, if you think we're, you're whatever you do is insignificant, then why do you vote? You know, one vote makes no difference, you know. So of course we vote, because we know that one and more, you know, just they're additive.
I'll
Okay.
just let me chime in
And
and say that I think another strategy, and this is I guess what we've adopted in Swap One, is to create a local sense of doing something together and collectively
Yeah.
making a difference at a local level, and giving people a sense that they can make a difference and giving them visibility of that through a local campaign. And I think if our civic leaders would get out in front of this and talk about it, talk about how we can achieve this, talk about how we can do it together and be proud of it as a city. I think that starts to put into the mindset of the local people, how can I help? What can I do? What is my part in the bigger picture? If our civic leaders are talking about this as something that Nelson is doing and striving for, it makes a difference.
I have a comment too, Jim. I'm going to
Yeah.
have two very different comments, actually. I used to have a little bottle with water in it and 1 grain of sand in it. And I'd shake this and say, you know, that little bit of sand doesn't count. But if you think it doesn't count, then you're saying, I don't believe in beaches, because beaches are a lot of grains of sand. Now, that's one extreme. But the real point I want to make is that, to me, this question from Lucy and Dave, thank you, dials back to the question of public engagement. And I think all sorts of strategies, Jim has touched on them, to help bring us up to speed, where we really, as a public, have almost no idea what's coming down the pipeline at us. And the thing is that we can do stuff now which isn't nearly as painful as it'll be later if we delay it and kick the can further down the road. And in particular, if I just spend a moment touching on citizens' assemblies, which is part of a process known as participatory democracy. And the key thing is that, or two key things. One is that you get a very big group of people, it might be 30 or 40 or even 100 in some situations, carefully chosen to represent all sectors of the community. So it's not people putting their hand up and saying me, it's actually a statistical process. And then there's a robust process for getting these people informed and then encouraging a deliberation is the key word, encouraging them to think together and very carefully about it. And these are all ways, that is, of getting people further up to speed. And so your question, Lucy, about, well, how about businesses that don't think their bit matters? This is all part of the thing. All of our bits matter. Kia ora.
Can I just add to this?
Peter, go ahead.
Lindsay and I have slightly diverging views on this, but um, adding to what Lindsay's saying is that if we make, as they did in Holland, make cycling the no-brainer, the most easiest thing to do, then people will do that, and that's what the congestion charge did in Stockholm, and that's what we're proposing here. That you're just nudging people just to make it a little bit more expensive, and you know they'll do it even if they don't believe in climate change, even if they don't think their thing is their emissions matter, because they've been nudged by this in financial incentive. Likewise with peripheral parking charges, suddenly you can't drive into the centre of Nelson and park around it and easily walk to your work. You know that might just be the incentive you need to think, oh look, I'll try the bus, or perhaps Swap One is encourage them to do a low carbon commute, and they find it, you know, it's great, so they'll keep doing it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We have just a couple comments. John Lazenby says, many thanks for this team. Karen Driver says, Ngā mihi nui for this presentation. I'll be keen to share it through my networks nationally as well as locally. So thank you all for attending. I just got another comment coming in from Tim and Barbara Robson. Further to well-beingness, don't forget the joy of community and meeting people, the benefits of bus and bike travel. Thank you, team. Really helpful. Assume this will be sent to our new council. So we have recorded this, and we are planning to share it. We'll try to send out a link to this to all those who have registered, so you can share it with your networks as well. Look out for it on the climate forums social media platforms. I think we're on Instagram, and we'll be sharing this via that channel as well, hopefully. So I just want to say thank you all again, and I'll finish with a karakia. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia watia ai te ara. Kia turiki whakataa ai, kia turiki whakataha ai. Homye, huye, taikie. Restrictions are moved aside so that pathway is clear to return to our everyday activities, and we could add a pathway to achieving Nelson's 8.3% emissions reduction target.
For that.
Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day. Namihi nui kia toko. Koto.
The order.